Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to the 8th Bhagat Singh Memorial Lecture. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. We have gathered here not merely for a lecture, but for a conversation that demands clarity and courage. The theme that brings us into this shared space is India in the global power game, US imperialism, and India's position. In a world structured by unequal power, the question of imperialism is not abstract. It shapes lives, nations, and futures. I'm sure that today's discussion will challenge us to rethink India's place within this global order and to confront uncomfortable truths about power and complicity. We are honored to have with us Professor Prabhat Patnaik, one of India's most distinguished Marxist political economists. A former professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, his work has consistently engaged with questions of capitalism, imperialism, and development. He is widely known for his incisive critiques on neoliberal economic policies and for foregrounding the structural inequalities embedded in the global economic order. We are also privileged to have Atul Chandra chairing today's session, who is a researcher and coordinator of the Asia desk at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Let us engage critically, question deeply, and carry forward a politics that resists domination in all its forms. On that note, I conclude my welcome address and warmly hand over the session to our chair, Atul Chandra.
Thank you so much, comrades. Very happy to see Professor Patnaik here. Hello, sir. It's a profound privilege to chair the 8th Bhagat Singh Memorial Lecture. And as we have already heard in the welcome address that we are not here for a mere academic exercise, but to sharpen our understanding of the current world system, I would say, which is in crisis. It is I think Professor Patnaik has already been introduced, and the organizers have asked me to offer some framing remarks, and I want to use these initial few minutes to make an argument that India's current foreign policy is not merely a series of I would say, of diplomatic choices, but a reflection of deeper structural subordination, in my opinion, born out of course, neoliberal integration. And as in the welcome address, it was already said that neoliberalism is not simply an economic policy framework. It is the contemporary form through which imperialism reconstitutes its dominance over the periphery. Right, when a third world state, like let's name it Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, they wants to adopt when they adopt the neoliberal program. They liberalize their capital, they open their markets to the metropolitan finance, and also submit to the international credit markets. So it does not just change the strategy; it surrenders their material preconditions of their sovereign action. A state that depends on foreign capital to finance its deficits and calibrates its laws to satisfy the rating agencies cannot conduct, in my opinion, an independent foreign policy. And sovereignty is then, of course, mortgaged at the level of economic structure. Uh, this is the lens through which I would request all of you present here to examine India's trajectory. The crisis of Indian foreign policy under the Modi government is not a crisis of diplomatic miscalculation, as I already informed you. It is the political expression, in my opinion, of a deeper structural subordination produced by 3 decades of neoliberal integration into a US-centered global order. You cannot pursue neoliberal economics domestically while claiming strategic autonomy internationally. The logic of neoliberalism requires keeping the economy open to the metropolitan capital, and that openness is the lever through which the imperialist and the power which dictates them disciplines the peripheral states into compliance. In India's current trajectory, in my opinion, is a break from its historical role. From the Bandung Conference of 1955 through the non-alignment movement, India functioned as a leading voice for what we know today as Global South. The Global South. We keep on hearing our Prime Minister saying that we are the leaders of the Global South. I mean, the Global South countries look at us. Even a lot of developed countries look towards us. While we must be critical, we all know, I mean, initially just after the independence, we are very critical of the Nehruvian developmental state, acknowledging we also acknowledge its internal contradiction and class limitations which it had. But we also know that it possessed a social welfarist model and a public sector capacity that gave substance to non-alignment. And it maintained the structural strength to absorb the cost of dissent from the imperial center, I would say, or the forces which wanted us to follow them. Uh, I can cite few examples. India, I mean, then at that time, India could take positions on Palestine, on the apartheid South Africa, on the new international economic order, because it possessed, in my opinion, the structural capacity to absorb the cost of dissent. Today, that capacity has collapsed. We are witnessing a shift from being leader of the periphery to becoming a subordinate partner of the core. Uh, uh, let's look at uh, uh, Palestine itself. On Palestine, India has moved from being among the first countries to recognize the PLO to strategic and military partnership with Israel today, encompassing the arms purchases, of course, worth billions, intelligence sharing, we all know, and political alignment at the highest levels. On Iran, we know that there is a war in West Asia. I'm pretty sure Professor Prabhat Patnaik will speak on it. Uh, I mean, the jump is huge. I mean, when the Trump administration reimposed sanctions in 2018, India reduced oil imports from 500,000 barrels per day to near zero by May 2029. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, if you remember, stated publicly that when a waiver was given to India, that India has been allowed a temporary waiver, the same language we see today, which are, I mean, with regard to again Iran war and the Russian oil which we buy. Uh, the language of permission tells us everything about the real power relationship beneath partnership rhetoric. India, of course, it left its cheaper energy, jeopardized the Chabahar port, which was very important for the Indian state to business in West Asia, and abandoned a relationship of strategic value because Washington demanded it. And today, as the US-Israel war drives, we are already looking at the news, and we get every day we are seeing at the videos West Asia is being forced towards catastrophe as Iran exercises its leverage over the Strait of Hormuz and Asia's and we can see the Asia's entire energy architecture comes under threat. Look at India. I mean, it occupied as chair of BRICS that position on 1st January 2026. We did not issue a single statement of solidarity with Iran at the very moment when India's own national interests, its energy security, its food supply chains, its macroeconomic stability are directly being undermined. The Indian government cannot articulate a position that diverges from Washington's. This is not a strategic ambiguity. This reflects subordination, in my opinion. Meanwhile, I mean, and we were expecting a lot. We thought that okay, because we have subordinated ourselves, we'll get a lot of I mean leverage from the Washington, which did not happen. If you remember, the 26% compound tariffs on our Indian steel and aluminum last year, that demonstrate that full compliance with the imperial state doesn't give you any protection. This pattern, if we look, is also extends further. The Modi government, if you look at the Modi government, what does it do with regard to its foreign affairs? It cultivates its relationships with the far right governments globally, from Netanyahu's Israel to the to broader network of authoritarian nationalists who share not a vision of the global South solidarity, but a vision of civilizational chauvinism and market fundamentalism. India's international partnerships are no longer oriented toward the collective interest of the periphery. They are oriented towards ideological affinity with forces that serve the same class projects everywhere. Sorry for the coughing. Uh, The entrenchment of capital's power over labor, we have already seen in all these countries. Against against this, India's security, its development, and its democratic future require partnerships built on equal footings, relationships where sovereignty of a country is respected, is reinforced, and not diluted. And in the similar way, in my opinion, India should move more towards multi, I would say, multipolar organizations like SCO, BRICS, the traditions of South-South cooperation. These are, I would say, in my opinion, existing institutional spaces within which genuine multipolarity can be constructed. But they require political will, and political will requires a domestic class configuration that is not to be beholden to the metropolitan capital. Let me conclude by addressing the ideological questions that cuts across everything I have said. Every phase of imperial domination has required a narrative that presents extraction as generosity and subordination as uplift and violence as civilization. The classical form is well known. Remember Kipling's white man's burden, the rhetoric of bringing law and commerce to people deemed incapable of self-governance. What demands our attention is that the civilizing mission is now being stated openly once again. Remember Marco Rubio's address at Munich Security Conference in February this year? Rubio dispensed with euphemisms of rule-based order. He presented the entire arc of modern history as a story of Western civilizational achievement, framing the Cold War as a contest in which Europe and America prevailed. The non-Western world, the theater in which the Cold War was most violently prosecuted, from Korea to Vietnam, from Guatemala to Angola, simply did not exist in his account. This is what Samir Amin identified as Eurocentrism at the level of grand strategy. The particular trajectory of Western Europe universalized as the singular path of human civilization, while the rest of humanity is rendered invisible. Rubio went further, framing migration from global south as essential threat to Western civilization, systematically inverting the causal chain. Migration produced by imperial wars, sanctions, and climate devastation was presented as invasion. As Franz Fanon understood in The Wretched of the Earth, the colonized moved toward the metropole, drawn by the very wealth that was taken from them. To frame this as civilizational threat while erasing the civilizational violence that produced it is ideology of the most calculated kind, and that is US and the leadership there. This is the civilizing mission in its 2026 form, openly asserting Western supremacy, openly defending colonial legacies, openly casting the global South as a space to be dominated. And India is aligning with the very ideological formation that justified its own colonization, in my opinion. Yet, precisely because this legitimation is cracking, because the genocide in Gaza has shattered its credibility for millions, the violence intensifies. This is what Professor Patnaik has identified as the dialectics of aggression. US belligerence proceeding not from strength, but from the weakening of its hegemonic position. It is in this conjecture that Professor Patnaik will address this evening. With that, it is my great pleasure to invite him to deliver the 8th Bhagat Singh Memorial Lecture. Thank you and welcome, sir. You are on mute, sir. You are on mute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Comrade Atul Chandra. And thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to speak to this audience and to have a discussion with them. Let me begin with a bit of historical background. You see, after the Second World War left the old imperialist countries greatly weakened. One consequence of it, of course, was decolonization and an order in which came into being, in which the United Nations was included, which respected the sovereignty of individual nations. That basically every nation was sovereign, no matter how unpopular its government may be, how repressive its government may be, it is not the job of other countries to intervene and to change the government, but rather, in exceptional cases, if the entire Committee of Nations, that is the United Nations, feels that certain measures have to be taken against a particular regime, then the UN as a whole may in fact impose sanctions on that particular regime, as were imposed, for instance, against South Africa. But that was essentially based on the sovereignty of each nation. Sovereignty also included that each nation must have control over its own natural resources. And this is something which imperialism sought to resist, but of course was made possible through what I would call the economic decolonization, as distinct from political decolonization, with the help of the Soviet Union in particular. Now, therefore, this was an order that came into being that actually respected the sovereignty of all nations and their right to control the natural resources that they have. Imperialism, therefore, could not directly militarily intervene. US imperialism was the most powerful that was left on the earth. It could not directly militarily intervene, but it tried all kinds of ways of, in fact, intervening in particular cases in camouflage ways. It intervened in Guatemala when Arbenz was the president. It intervened, for instance, in Chile when Allende was the president. It intervened uh, in a number of places, but on the other hand, these interventions were not direct interventions by the US state, by the US state militarily, as is happening in Iran today. There were interventions through the CIA, there were interventions to have various coups, like, for instance, the intervention against Mossadegh when he nationalized oil in Iran, and so on. One can think of innumerable instances where the efforts to undermine the global order respecting the sovereignty of individual nations, most of whom had become free and decolonized recently. But these were, as it were, camouflaged attempts. They were not kind of direct open military attempts. Now, one consequence of this, of course, is that even though the United States was the leading imperialist country of the world, it had no colonies. It did not have colonies in the post Second World War period because colonialism was, in fact, a past phenomenon. I'm not saying that if the US had had colonies, then the history of capitalism might have been greatly different. That's a separate issue. But the fact of the matter is that it did not have colonies. Now, the absence of colonies for the US has had an impact, which I think we should look at carefully. Look at British imperialism, which was the previous dominant imperialism, whose heyday was really before the First World War. British imperialism was one under whose aegis you had a diffusion of capitalism from Britain to continental Europe and from continental Europe to the various temperate regions of white settlement, like the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. There was a massive diffusion of capitalism. This diffusion was made possible because the Britain, on the one hand, kept its own market open to these countries, and on the other hand, also made capital exports to them to facilitate this diffusion. Because of which, vis-a-vis all these countries, Britain had a massive balance of payments deficit. But on the other hand, Britain did not get indebted. It did not get indebted because of the fact that it extracted huge amounts of what Indian nationalist writers call drain. I'll give you one figure. If you take the year 1910, which is just before the First World War, in 1910, total deficit of Britain, that is both current and capital account, vis-a-vis the United States and continental Europe, came to about $95 million. $60 million was the drain from India in that particular year. Therefore, the drain from India financed two-thirds of the total balance of payments deficit that Britain had with those countries with whom it had large deficits. Therefore, Britain could fulfill its leadership role. And I must say, the leadership role necessarily requires the leader to run a balance of payments deficit vis-a-vis the newly industrializing countries of that time. But it did not get into any debt. On the contrary, it was making capital exports because of the fact that it had this huge drain from the colonies. India was one, but there was Malaya and then there was West Indies and so on, and also the deindustrializing exports that it made to the same countries. Therefore, colonialism played a crucial role in stabilizing capitalism, in the process of diffusion of capitalism, and in maintaining the supremacy of British leadership during the time that all this was happening in the pre-First World War period. Now, the US had no such colonies, no such things to fall back upon, because of which the US, which also, as a leader of the imperial world, was running deficits, and the deficits it ran were partly meant to finance the nearly 800 bases it has all over the world in about 75 countries. So when you go and spend there, then obviously you have to have some deficit. Now, this deficit is something which the US financed not through any colonial drain because it didn't have colonies, but by printing dollars, by exporting its IOUs to the world. And the world was willing to hold its IOUs in the beginning because the fact that the dollar was linked to gold. That was the Bretton Woods system. $35 per ounce of gold was the price of gold. Dollar was convertible to gold because of which the world held the dollar. Even after the Bretton Woods system collapsed, because during the Vietnam War, the US really expanded its spending so much that actually the world was awash with dollars. And de Gaulle therefore said that, look, we don't want to hold these dollars, give us gold. And of course, there was not enough gold. And therefore, you had a situation where the Bretton Woods system collapsed. But even after the Bretton Woods system collapsed, it is still the case that the wealth holders of the world, including the various central banks and so on, which hold reserves, continued to hold the dollar as a reserve currency. And it is this which actually allowed the United States to keep running its deficits, which it is doing to this day. So you had this remarkable situation that the most powerful capitalist country in the world in the post-Second World War period is the most indebted. It is the most indebted country in the world, far more indebted than any third world country that borrows and so on to undertake capital formation. So this is a very peculiar situation. Such a situation has never arisen in the past, in the entire history of capitalism. And this situation, of course, makes the system quite vulnerable. Why does it make it vulnerable? You see, many people say that, look, this system can go on, it's not vulnerable because after all, there's no other currency which is as significant as the dollar. So nobody is going to shift from dollar to any other currency. Most of the commodities in the world, their prices are denominated in terms of dollars, their transactions are done in terms of dollars, and therefore dollar would continue to remain the reserve currency, the de facto key currency, and no other currency can really take its place. But what this argument misses is that while it is possible that there would be no shift from the dollar to any other currency, there might be a shift from the dollar to commodities. And if you have a shift of from dollar to commodities, there will be a huge commodity price inflation, destabilizing the entire system because of the fact that the world is now sitting on top of a mountain of dollars. So if for some reason the collapse in the confidence, if the confidence in the dollar collapses, then you would have a massive inflation. Now, something like this, as I mentioned earlier, actually happened in the wake of the Vietnam War, Vietnam armaments expenditure. That the early 1970s saw a massive shift from dollar to commodities, because of which commodity prices shot up. That's when people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan came to power, and they came to power promising to beat the inflation by reducing demand, generating unemployment, and also bringing about engineering a collapse of commodity prices because of the reduction in demand. Now, that is something which, of course, is the standard capitalist trick of controlling inflation. Then you control inflation by beating the commodity producers, primary commodity producers, third world peasants, and also by beating the working class in your domestic economy. But the point is that we have to now look at the context, because in early 1970s, when Thatcher and Reagan were beating the working class, that working class had actually seen a fairly substantial boom in the post-war period. So that working class had actually grown up during a period of boom, and consequently there was some room for beating up. But now the context is one where neoliberal capitalism has given rise to a massive increase in income inequality, in which the peasants of the third world, the workers all over the world, have actually been the real sufferers. In fact, according to Joseph Stiglitz, an American economist, the real wage of an average male American worker in 2011 was marginally lower in absolute terms than in 1968. And we know that in India, for instance, the level of inequality in 2023, in the form of, let us say, the share of the top 1% in the total national income, was higher than at any time in the previous 100 years. So we have reached this point of massive increase in inequality at the expense of the workers and peasants of the world. Now, because of which, you also have a crisis of overproduction, because obviously, if you have income that is being shifted from the workers and peasants to the capitalists and their hangers on, to those who survive on the surplus, in that case, they consume less out of their incomes in any given period than the workers and peasants. If you give a rupee to the worker, to a worker, that worker would more or less consume the whole rupee. If you give a rupee to a rich man, that rich man might consume 50 paise, keep the remaining 50 paise in the pocket, saying that I'll spend it later. That spending it later is what is called savings by economists, and therefore every such income distribution means a reduction in consumption and an increase in savings, which mean no demand for any goods, and therefore a tendency towards overproduction. This tendency towards overproduction then manifests itself in terms of an increase in unemployment. And in fact, you find that sometimes this increase in unemployment is camouflaged by a reduction in the worker participation rate, like in the case of the United States. But there is very significant unemployment that has arisen in this period. There is a stagnation in world capitalism, and this stagnation is accompanied by unemployment. And if it is the case that this period of stagnation, not only in employment but in wages, is then added to by anti-inflationary measures in the event of a flight from dollar to commodities, in that case, the system would find it impossible to sustain itself socially. In other words, the social stability of capitalism today is so precarious that everybody feels the need to do something about it. Now, what can be done about it? The two obvious measures which capitalism is trying out, one, of course, is a transition to neo-fascism. All over the world, there is a very strong tendency towards neo-fascism, whether you look at Argentina, whether you look at the United States, whether you look at India, whether you look at Israel, which of course is in a category of its own, whether you look at Italy, whether you look at Orban in Hungary, and those who are waiting in the wings, like, for instance, the AfD in Germany, like Marine Le Pen in France, you actually find, or UKIP in Britain, you find a real significant shift towards neo-fascism all over the world. That is one way in which capitalism is seeking to protect itself against a possible threat to its dominance that may come about in the event of a real economic kind of, crisis. Now, the second way in which capitalism is trying to bolster itself is what really concerns me today, and that is through a recolonization of the third world. And this is something which you find in fact, Comrade Atul Chandra referred to the speech by Marco Rubio. It is obvious, when Trump says that Iran has oil and we must get it, and those who think we should not get it are stupid. When Marco Rubio says that Western civilization was challenged by communism and the anti-colonial struggles which were supported by communism has got greatly weakened. Obvious thing is that to revive Western civilization, you must weaken the anti-colonial struggles, which is the same as saying the gains of anti-colonial struggles and therefore recolonization. The attempt at recolonizing the world is in fact one way in which capitalism believes that it can sustain itself, it can face the coming challenges, and of course, it can sustain the hegemony of the dollar. Now, you may ask, what is the connection between recolonization and the hegemony of the dollar? I mentioned earlier the case of Britain, where colonialism helped Britain to retain the hegemony of the pound sterling, despite running huge balance of payment surpluses vis-a-vis the newly industrializing countries. Now, the United States runs surpluses vis-a-vis every country in the world, but at the same time, if you have access to oil, which is the most important commodity, in that case, any flight from the dollar to oil can be checkmated. Any attempt to make payments for oil in currencies other than dollar can be checkmated. And you can also have a situation where the oil producers would then all be retaining their reserves in the form, their currency reserves in the form of dollars. So having access to the most important commodity in the world today, that is oil, is something which would be a great step in bolstering the position of the dollar. Of course, the US has made it very clear that it is not really interested only in oil. It wants Greenland, it wants Canada, it wants various other places where it would then be able to tap the existing raw materials and therefore be able to make sure that it does not have the kind of balance of payments deficits. It does not continue getting into further and further debt. And that is one, to my mind, very important reason why the US is keen on recolonizing the world, and in particular, recolonizing those segments of the world which are particularly rich in mineral resources. Now, obviously, it is not only mineral resources. I believe the Indo-US trade deal was in fact another instance of recolonization, because it is what in colonial times would be called an unequal treaty. It was a treaty in which the US would impose tariffs on Indian goods, but India would reduce its tariffs to zero on the US goods. It was a patently unequal treaty. Currently, it has been deferred, but the fact remains that these are all ways of the US attempt to recolonize the world, and they are not making any secret of it. They are not actually hiding it in any way. Like in the old days, when you overthrew Mossadegh or Allende or something, you are hiding it in some form. CIA coup, local. When you talk of color revolutions in Eastern Europe, you really say, oh, local people have risen, we have actually helped them and so on. But this is very clear, no hiding, very clear expression of an attempt to recolonize the world. Now, and of course, this is abrogation of the notion of sovereignty. It's abrogation of the order which had been imposed by the Committee of Nations upon themselves in the post-Second World War period, and which was a defense that any third world country had against direct imperial military intervention. There had been attempt, as I mentioned, at that time, some had succeeded, but in the case of others, for instance, they had not. I mean, when Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, you actually had an Anglo-French invasion, but the Soviet Union gave a threat, and of course, you had the, the troops of Britain and France going back, and Anthony Eden had to resign as the Prime Minister of Britain. Now, similarly, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, the Soviet Union asked its ships that were heading towards Cuba to shoot through the American blockade. At which point Kennedy rang up Khrushchev through the hotline, and an agreement was reached that, okay, the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba, but on condition that there would never again be a military intervention by the US against Cuba. And of course, that has remained till today honored, the promise that was given by them. So the point is that, of course, the Soviet Union acted as a bulwark to preserve this order of non-intervention in the sovereignty of nations, but that non-intervention was the essence of the order, and that is what is being changed today. Now, the Indian government has been actually abysmal when you look at it from one point of view. In fact, as Comrade Atul Chandra pointed out, this was a country that was in Bandung. This was a country that was a leader of the non-aligned movement. The entire non-aligned movement was really a way of confronting imperialism on the part of all the newly liberated countries of the world. But that same country today is now, in fact, a kind of, kowtowing to imperialism like never before. The other day, Britain called a meeting of 50 countries in order to criticize Iran for closing the Strait of Hormuz. India was one of them. There was not a word in that entire resolution that was passed or in the speech of the British Foreign Secretary criticizing the invasion of Iran. Not a word. So it is only a one-sided criticism. Iran is being criticized. What is more, even in the UN resolution, which India was one of the sponsors, there was a criticism of Iran for attacking the neighboring Gulf states. While Iran never attacked the Gulf states, it only attacked American facilities located in the Gulf states. But nonetheless, there was a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly which was criticizing Iran, but not a word criticizing the US-Israeli invasion of Iran. And India has been in the forefront of this entire kowtowing. I'll give you a contrast with it. When the Americans had bombed Gaddafi's palace was bombed, you may remember some years ago. His daughter was killed in that bombing. There was a group of non-aligned countries, foreign ministers, led by the Indian foreign minister. Indira Gandhi was the prime minister, led by the Indian foreign minister, that went to express solidarity with Gaddafi in Libya. So the point is, here was a country that was standing up to imperialism, leading the third world, but that same country now kowtows to imperialism and abandons any third world interest. And look at the debates that take place. Look at the discussion that takes place. Many people who actually defend this say, oh, it's in our national interest that we should not, when we are doing foreign policy, we should not get carried away by principles and ethics and morality, but we should really look at our national interest. And our national interest demands that we should not offend the United States. We'll get some arms from them, we'll get lower tariffs from them, etc., etc. Whether we get them or not is not the point. But the point is that this is not an issue of tariffs or not an issue of getting some arms from them. It is an issue of the freedom of the Indian people. National sovereignty, respect for national sovereignty, is the basis for decolonization. The moment you actually give up the idea that national sovereignty must be respected, is going to hit you, because people are then going to decolonize, reverse your own process of decolonization. They're not to send viceroys anymore, but they would actually have such governments as are beholden to imperialism, not governments expressing the will of the people. So the point is that that India's stand has been absolutely abysmal in this, and it has been based on considerations which are petty, considerations which have to do with all this notion of national interest, in the sense of getting some tariff concession here, getting some arms there, and so on. And the question is, why has this happened? I mean, obviously, most people would say that this is a timidity of the BJP-led government. But I think Comrade Atul Chandra was absolutely right, that this is really something which comes as the acme, as the climax of this entire process of neoliberalism. Neoliberal regime has made has had two very basic impacts, and I think we must very carefully look at those impacts. One is the destruction, the fracturing of the concept of a nation that we had during the anti-colonial struggle. You see, the third world concept of a nation against imperialism was fundamentally different from the first world concept of a nation that developed in the wake of the Westphalia peace agreements. The European notion of the nation and nationalism always found an internal enemy, an enemy within, which was the Catholics in Northern Europe, the Protestants in Southern Europe, the Jews everywhere, and so on. There was always an enemy within against which the nation had to unite. Secondly, it was a nation which was from the very beginning imperialist. Oliver Cromwell went on an expedition to conquer Ireland and succeeded in doing it within months of the Westphalia peace agreements. So from the very beginning, the European concept of nation was imperialist. And the third very important feature is that this concept of nation basically put the nation above the people. The people had to serve the nation. Now, this is the concept of nation which ultimately reaches its denouement in fascism. Because in fascism, the nation is symbolized by the leader, and everybody who is supposed to serve the nation and therefore be loyal to the leader. And of course, the other, that is the Jews, are in fact exterminated. 6 million of them are exterminated, and so on. So that this concept of nation reaches its denouement, it reaches its apogee in the in the fascist period, which is one reason why in Europe there's a lot of distrust of nationalism. But what they do not recognize is that the anti-colonial concept of the nation was very different. Anti-colonial concept of the nation was Firstly, it was inclusive. It was inclusive. There was, I mean, that was what informed the anti-colonial struggle. I'm not saying it always succeeded in keeping it together. We know in our own country there was a partition of the country. But the concept of nationalism, which actually was sought to be projected, was one that actually was inclusive. And that inclusiveness has carried over to the post-independence period, where everybody has a set of rights, independent of your religion, independent of your ethnicity, and so on. Likewise, it was a concept of a nation where, far from being imperialist, you in fact try and stood shoulder to shoulder with other countries fighting for their liberation. In fact, India stood shoulder to shoulder with Indonesia and so on in their anti-colonial struggles. And thirdly, to the notion of a nation, concept of a nation, where the nation was not above the people, but rather you actually had the purpose of the nation was to serve the people. In fact, Gandhiji's words are very important, that the idea of the nation is to wipe the tears from the eyes of every Indian. So that would the nation was supposed to serve the people. As a matter of fact, that concept of the nation is being abandoned. In fact, in Delhi, you have all these kartavya paths and this and that, all of which emphasize duty. Nobody emphasizes rights. In this entire renaming spree that is going on, the government's emphasis is that you owe duties to the nation, not that you have any rights. The nation doesn't owe anything to you, and the nation is symbolized by the leader, and therefore you owe your loyalty to the leader. Now, that fracturing is something which really began with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism fractured the old idea of the nation. It actually encouraged some people to become rich. I talked about the inequalities that emerged. Development was then taken to be synonymous with the fact that GDP was growing, even though much of this GDP may be accruing to the top 1% or top 10%, didn't matter. So that was a fracturing of the nation, not that you had everybody improving their lot, though there are all kinds of statistical fiddles to show that, actually, even the poor have become better off. That's complete nonsense. But so that is the fracturing of the notion, concept of the nation, which is why the fact that the nation's sovereignty is in peril is something that does not perhaps concern the government as much, as indeed it doesn't concern other governments. I mentioned 135 countries, after all, in the United Nations stood up and voted on a resolution which was not critical of the US-Israeli axis, but was critical of Iran. The second reason why this fracturing of nation has also been accompanied by a fracturing of the third world is the fact that the entire export-led growth strategy, which neoliberalism apotheosizes, that growth strategy, its core is what is called beggar thy neighbor. I become a successful exporter at your expense by stealing markets from you. Therefore, I develop at your expense. In fact, you can see even now in the general the conversation we have in this country, when the Indo-US trade deal was being talked about, the idea was, is it going to help our exports rather than, at the expense of Bangladesh? So the whole idea is that we should be able to export more rather than Bangladesh. And therefore the whole idea of export-led growth, the whole idea of beggar thy neighbor policy upon which export-led growth is based is something which fractures the third world. So fracturing of the nation and fracturing of the third world, which has been a contribution of neoliberalism, is something which is a prelude to what we see today, where the government is completely oblivious of the immoral, illegal war that imperialism is waging against Iran. But of course, the fact that the Iranian people have stood up to it, the fact that they have overcome their internal differences. The Iranian regime is not very popular among my students and friends. I mean, I have lots of students and friends in Iran. The regime is not popular, but all of them are standing together against imperialism. The fact that that is going on and Iran is teaching some lessons to this hegemonic power that wants to recolonize the world is something from which all of us must take satisfaction. If Iran remains free, all of us would remain free. And therefore, our solidarity is with Iran. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. This is very important. I think it's. I also know so many friends of mine. I mean, who in different countries right now have gone back to their country in Iran. Like they're Iranians who have gone back just to not to fight the regime, but to stand with the regime, despite having reservations with the regime, saying that this is something not done. Also, I think this is very important in terms of what Professor Prabhat has said. I would also request every one of you to, if you have any questions, please feel free. This is very important, and let us know. The chat box is open for all of you, and I think there are questions. Sonal, please go ahead. You can ask questions. Yeah, I think you can open your mic and ask the question. Correct.
Hello, sir. It has been a pleasure hearing you, and red salute to you. I just have a question. I'm not from economics background, but I've recently just started dabbling into a little bit of readings. So I was reading a book by Amit Bhaduri and Deepak Nayyar, where they, sort of create a distinction between how this neoliberal or liberal regime and the Soviet socialism, but they have been focusing on how Soviet socialism failed primarily because they did not have sort of self-correcting mechanism. I would like to hear your opinion on that, if you would, elaborate and enlighten us a little. And thank you for the lecture once again.
Thank you.
Shall I take a number of questions and then answer them? I'm noting them down.
Exactly. That's what I would suggest. If there are other questions, comrades, if not, we'll go ahead with the question. But if there are, please let us know. Please, Haran Rajesh, please go ahead.
Greetings, sir. I'm Haran Rajesh. I'm from Central University of Kerala, Capital Center. I'm studying BA in International Relations. So I had a doubt regarding the neo-fascist trend that is arriving in Europe. I had a doubt on what specific economic and foreign policy are they pitching for, which is coming in Europe. So, and what implications it might have for the emerging world order and the global capitalist relations as a whole. Thank you, sir, for the lecture. It was very enlightening, sir.
Thank you.
Then we have Sir Jasdeep Singh. His question: how do we characterize the Indian bourgeois class in the context of neoliberalism? If America is successful in penetrating Indian markets in the way it has through the trade deal, should we understand the Indian capitalist class as being an appendage of imperialism? Or is it still a national bourgeois with its own interests that go against imperialism's interest? Should we characterize them as comprador?
Maybe I should take these three questions.
Correct. Yeah, I think,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Sonal's question, you see, I think neoliberalism is not just, okay, I mean, obviously is market fundamentalism, but is market fundamentalism that actually promotes enormous levels of inequality, because the entire growth under neoliberalism is supposed to occur through private investment. Therefore, the entire policy of the state becomes the encouragement of private investment, give tax concessions, this and that, and as a result, you have whatever growth occurs, one that is really associated with greatly increased inequalities. Now, the problem with the Soviet Union was different. That was a problem where you had, possible to argue, at least I would say, excessive centralization. That you see, Marxism believes in the freedom. I mean, Marxism is a freedom project. Marxism is not a rate of growth project. Marxism is not a project, in which you can really say, the Soviet Union has a 7% growth rate and therefore, it is a superior system and so on. Marxism is a freedom project. Its whole point is to rid the individual of the compulsions in which capitalism traps you. And therefore, if you have a centralized system in which the individual laborer becomes a resource, in that case, in some sense, it's a violation of the freedom project. In other words, it is in some sense mirroring the objectification of the individual that the market does. But of course, the objectification is done not by the market, but by a plan. So I would say that the people must have a say, direct say, in their economic destiny, in their politics, and that is something which can be done only through a decentralized system. Every individual can attend a meeting in let's say a panchayat, but every individual can't attend a meeting in the parliament. And therefore, in some sense, indirect representation is not enough, that people must have a direct say on their own destiny, and that say, to be meaningful, must entail decentralization of a number. I'm not saying all of it can be decentralized, but decentralization of a number of crucial spheres of decision making. And I think this is where the Soviet Union failed, that the Soviet Union did great things, great things. I mean, I just mentioned it was a bulwark against imperialism. It defeated fascism. It built up the most gigantic welfare state the world had ever seen. But nonetheless, there was a failure in the Soviet Union, at least I'm talking about the realm of the economy, and that failure consisted in the fact that it did not empower the people to take decisions which could have been possible if you had decentralization. Now, Rajesh's question, there is a base, why I call it neo-fascism is because there's a fundamental difference between old fascism and neo-fascism. You see, there are a lot of similarities. After all, that's why we use the term fascism. And similarities are in the form of othering a hapless minority, the Muslims or the Jews or the blacks or whatever, that, and creating hatred against it. That is the most fundamental feature of fascism. It is, of course, highly repressive, but the repression of the state is compared by repression by the fascist thugs, balailas in Mussolini's Italy, and so on. Which, by the way, is the inspiration behind the ABVP in India, because an Indian RSS leader called Dr. Munje had gone to Italy to study Mussolini's methods and was very impressed by the balailas, and came back and wanted to start a similar thing, which is how the RSS was started. Then you, of course, have a very close relationship between monopoly capital and fascism, and a particularly close relationship between some new segments of monopoly capital and fascism. Shinko Zaibatsu in Japan, of course, Zaibatsu, but within the Zaibatsu or Shinko Zaibatsu. Similarly, in Germany, Daniel Gerin, the anarchist writer, has written a book called Fascism and Big Business, in which he talks about the old monopoly, who all supported fascism, but within them a new monopoly that had emerged in the producers' goods industries, armaments and so on, particularly close to fascism. If you have seen Visconti's film called The Damned, that actually discusses this. If you have not, must make it a point to see it. Then in India, similarly, the Adanis and so on are the new monopoly elements. They are very close to the government, which is not to say that the old ones are against the government. They are all close to the government, but Adani's particularly. And of course, the cult of the leader, where the leader stands for the nation, is a substitute for the nation. The nation stands for the people, above the people, and so on. So the leader stands above the people, and so on. Now, these are all features common to classical fascism and neo-fascism. But where it is different is that classical fascism, both in Germany and Japan, used huge amounts of fiscal deficit in order to generate employment through military expenditure. There are large numbers of people who enlisted into the army and so on. Real wages fell in Germany between 33 and 39, but employment increased fantastically. As a matter of fact, okay, we'll discuss this later. As a matter of fact, you have Japan being the first country to come out of the Great Depression. Now, that is not possible today. Because you see, fiscal deficits are disliked, as you know, by finance capital, which is why everywhere in the world you have this fiscal responsibility legislation. Now, if the finance capital is national, German finance capital, Japanese finance capital, in that case, you can have a close relationship between the fascist governments and finance capital. They can be persuaded to allow larger fiscal deficits by the government. But if finance capital is globalized, while the government is a nation state's government, in that case, there is no question of the government overriding the desires of finance capital. As a matter of fact, even in Britain, when Liz Truss was the prime minister, she outlined her budgetary plans. Her budgetary plans was to enlarge the fiscal deficit to subsidize capitalists, not to enlarge fiscal deficit to subsidize workers or to increase the welfare state. Even so, the fact that she was enlarging the fiscal deficit is something which made finance flow out of Britain. Pound sterling fell. Liz Truss had to resign, became the shortest serving prime minister in the entire history of Britain. So the point is that today's neo-fascism is incapable of overcoming the crisis and stagnation that afflicts capitalism. And that is why you would find that it would be particularly vicious, and that the crisis of neoliberalism, as long as it continues, fascism would be around. Even if you get rid of fascism, a fascist government, they'll come back to power like Trump has done. So the point is that there is a big difference. That is why the economic policy, which is typically simply supporting big business, which is what they are doing now. Supporting big business is something which was being done under neoliberalism, but they carry it to an extreme. Similarly, in foreign policy, as I said, the fracturing of the concept of a nation means no concept of a national sovereignty that has to be defended, no concept of a national sovereignty to be defended alongside the other third world nations. Of course, all of them have been subjected to this, because of which now you have a kind of atomization of individual third world countries, which makes it easy for imperialism. And of course, therefore, is the interests of monopoly capital which are paramount. The whole idea is that you must not offend the Americans because of the fact that the Americans are going to give some contracts to Mr. Ambani or to Mr. Adani or somebody. Okay, now the last one about trade deal. The trade deal is anti-national from India's point of view, not because it hurt the monopoly capitalists, but because it hurt the peasants. It hurt the farmers. The trade deal is anti-farmer. So this monopoly capital class is perfectly capable of entering into unequal treaties with imperialism, provided these unequal treaties affect the workers and peasants and so on, rather than itself. Okay, and that is the whole point of the trade deal was that. This is what the Americans have been trying for a very long time. The Kisan agitation was against this. The Kisan agitation was the whole idea was to remove all this procurement and support prices and so on, let the market be left free, which basically means American food grains would keep coming here, and Indian farmers would then shift from food grain production to producing all kinds of cash crops required in the metropolitan countries. That would have undermined food security of the farmers, undermined food security of the country. Many African countries have done it and have actually faced famines because in a year in which the cash crop you are growing, suppose this price drops, then you don't have enough foreign exchange to import food grains. And what is more, even if you got some food grains as aid, the individual farmers would not have enough purchasing power to buy that food grain. As a result, Professor Romeo Bagchi, very well-known distinguished economist, passed away recently, refers to these as globalization famines. These are famines that arise because of globalization. So the point is that the trade deal is something which is not against the monopoly capital, but is against the farmers, against the peasants, against the workers, and so on. And what is more, I wouldn't, as implicit in my remarks about the fracturing of the national consciousness that had been built up in the anti-colonial struggle is the idea that we cannot talk anymore in terms of national bourgeoisie and comprador bourgeoisie and so on. Those relate to an earlier period. I think now monopoly capital everywhere is really integrated into a kind of global capitalist system. I mean, Indian capital is investing in Indonesia, just as American capital is investing in India. So you have an integrated system of capital, and it is this capital which is really making merry out of the neoliberal regime. Of course, the regime itself has run into a stagnation, but they are the beneficiaries of it.
Kamit, do you also want to speak on the West Bengal and the Kerala question?
What was the question? Can you just repeat?
Gautam has asked this question, and he was asking that why did West Bengal fell so low in per capita income despite the communist ideological hotspot, whereas Kerala managed to maintain?
Let me be very frank. I'm not someone who's actually particularly bothered about per capita income, because after all, I know this GSDP domestic product calculations, they don't mean anything. I do think that there's a general problem of Indian communism and in fact communism all over the world, and that's the following: that how do you? I mean, this is the problem that weakened the left in Bengal, and we have not yet been able to recover. How, if you want industrialization, you must have industries in your state. In that case, how do you get industries? The standard thing that neoliberalism tells you, IMF tells you, World Bank tells you, Modi tells you, everybody tells you, is you invite multinationals, make land available to them, make it easy for them to kind of set up things, remove taxes on them, etc. Now that is the thing that we have to resist. If we are going to resist that, then who becomes the? I mean, I would say that we have to resist it by experimenting with an idea where the decentralized entities, panchayats, the district panchayat itself becomes the owner of an industry. Why can't the industrial unit be set up by the panchayat, in which case the panchayat itself would find the land, because that land belongs to the farmers who themselves are members of the panchayat, so that there is no separation of an outsider coming and taking over your land, but rather you actually have the people who own the land themselves also owning the industry. In other words, we have to think along those lines. Okay, this has to be thought about. When I was in Kerala for a while, I had mooted this idea that, that okay, even if you don't do this, you actually, even if you invite the Tatars, make sure that the peasants whose land is being taken are given a share in the equity of the Tata enterprise, in which case they would not be denied capital gains and so on and so forth, which the Tatas have, because there are lots of instances where even if the peasants agree to sell the land today, day after tomorrow, they feel little because the price of that land has skyrocketed, and they had sent it for peanuts, sold it for peanuts. So you have to think in terms of new ways in which you do not simply rely upon capitalists to industrialize, but you must have alternative ways of industrialization through the panchayats, through the district panchayats, and so on and so forth. Sorry, there was a question that Comrade Geeta asked.
Yes.
Yeah. What was
Yeah.
it?
She's asking for suggestions, some readings on neoliberalism and global capitalism. What all reading should she keep?
Well, yeah. Have you had a look at the book that Utsa and I have written on imperialism? It's called Capital and Imperialism. Okay. Utsa is my wife, my colleague.
Yeah.
So Utsa and I have written a book called, it came out about 5 years ago, Capital and Imperialism. Just have a look at that. There's a lot of discussion of neoliberalism.
The other thing I would suggest, comrades, to all of you is to be regular reader of the Marxist. I know it's on the CPM website, but feel free to read. It's very important in my opinion. I really find it quite, I mean, in terms of my understanding. Sukriti, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Hello. Hello, good
Yeah,
hi.
evening, all. I want to thank the organizers, first of all, for providing us with this platform, and especially Professor Patnaik. My question diverges little bit from USA to China. Professor has very well explained the super imperialism of USA and how the dominance of dollar is based on the strategic global trade and oil. But we see in recent years, especially in this sanction driven geopolitical situation, China is trying to leverage this, and they're trying to expand the yuan, especially now Iran considering trades in yuan. Can you elaborate if and how Chinese yuan can pose a challenge for the USA?
well, okay, I mean, the reason why the dollar has this predominant position in the world economy is because people are willing to hold on to dollars. Dollar as a form of wealth is something which the wealth holders of the world welcome. Okay. Now, the reason they welcome is also because the dollar is a medium of circulation. In other words, the fact that it's a medium of circulation, the fact that transactions are carried out in terms of dollars is something which actually makes the wealth holders generally, kind of like the dollar as a form of wealth, provided, of course, they can be assured that the price of the dollar in terms of commodities is not going to fall sharply, or in terms of other currency, not to fall sharply. It's not to fall sharply in terms of other currency. It's not going to fall sharply in terms of other currencies, as long as other currencies are not made into medium of circulation or in which transactions are not carried out and so on. And it's not going to fall in terms of commodities as long as wages don't rise because there's enough unemployment, reserve army of labor is there, and of course commodity prices don't rise because of political pressures as well as economic pressures exerted on third world primary commodity producing countries. So the dollar has remained in this particular position. There used to be an additional prop for the dollar that arose from the fact that, look, if you hold your wealth in terms of dollar, suppose the Chinese held their wealth in terms of, their reserves in terms of dollars. If the dollar price falls, then the value of their reserves fall. And therefore, in some sense, the Chinese had an interest in preserving the value of the dollar. Now, that is something which increasingly is is becoming weaker because the Chinese have shifted away from holding dollar reserves. But even so, the fact that the dollar continues to be the medium of transaction for large numbers of commodities. And of course, the dollar is one in which, for instance, a lot of the oil producers hold their wealth. And this was one of the things that Saudi Arabia, for instance, was committed to doing, is something that actually stabilizes the value of the dollar. Now, I think, of course, that stability is slowly eroding. I mentioned the fact that China has moved away from holding these huge amounts of dollar reserves to holding other kinds of currency reserves. We know that the Iranians, for instance, are now privileging ships which actually are transacting in yuan to pass through the Hormuz Strait rather than ships transacting in dollars. All this is happening. But I still believe that I don't think that the challenge to dollar is an overnight challenge. It's not something that is going to happen tomorrow. It will happen over a longer period of time. And I think the immediate challenge to dollar is not so much from some other currency, but as I mentioned in my talk, from the possibility of a sudden upsurge in commodity prices. And that is something which, oddly enough, the Americans tried to prevent by capturing the world's oil. But in the process of capturing the world's oil, the oil prices have shot up. And that's always something which happens, that in the process, you're doing something to prevent X. Actually, you exacerbate X. Now, that's exactly what we are witnessing at this moment.
Yeah, Comrade, taking the advantage of the chair, I would like to ask you a question which I'm actually working right now on a dossier for Tricontinental. Your argument on recolonization as the second mechanism uh, for sustaining the hegemony was very important. I think that's for me to understand that, and I'm pretty sure even for our comrades here is very important. So I wanted to ask you to extend a little bit on that. In the Indo-Pacific, we see not only direct military presence of the US military, uh, but we also see the layered containment, the architectural containment, like for example, the Quad, the AUKUS, the bilateral defense agreements, and that draws peripheral relationship states basically into US command structures. So, in your assessment, what is the relationship between the economic logic of recolonization and the militarization of the Indo-Pacific? Uh, I ask this question because there is a tendency in mainstream strategic discourse to treat containment of China as purely geopolitical question. So that's the reason I was
Yes,
asking
yes.
you.
You're absolutely right that, that not that these two are completely watertight separate, but the point is that they represent two alternative perspectives. Okay, I mean they don't preclude one another. The other day I had a discussion with a comrade, and he was emphasizing the geopolitical aspects of it, that the US is interested in getting the world's resources to prevent China from getting it. Okay, and so on. While I was talking about the US getting it in order to sustain the value of the dollar and so on. Now, of course, it's very difficult to distinguish I mean, to kind of say this is right, that is not, and so on. And they don't preclude one another. But I think we should be clear that they do represent different emphases. Okay, and you are certainly right that that these two emphases have both to be kind of looked at in some ways. Maybe because I'm an economist, I actually give a lot of importance to the economic argument. But I think Trump's desperation to get hold of the world's resources and is something which has a certain economic core to it as opposed to simply geopolitical. I mean, I don't think the Chinese would have gone into Greenland. In other words, I think there is a certain economic core to Trump's desperation, and I think this core has to do with the current state of world capitalism. capitalism. I do think, that there is, of course, a situation of stagnation and unemployment, and on top of that, there is a certain fragility of the financial system.
Thank you, comrade.
Atul, your mic is muted.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Oh, okay. No, so I was saying that we can end the session, but before we end, I would really like you to repeat the name of the movie which you were saying, you were asking all of us to watch.
Very old movie. I'm a very old man, so I was talking about a movie very old. It's by Luchino Visconti, the well-known Italian director. It's called The Damned. Damned.
The
D-A-M-N-E-D. Yeah.
Okay. So
when the first film festival happened in India, I think Indira Gandhi was the information minister then. I think Shastri must have been the prime minister. In that Delhi Film Festival, The Damned had got the Golden Award. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Visconti. Yeah. Have a look at it.
Sure. So, is it okay to end? Basically, I think it's already 1.5 hours. If there are more questions, please feel free. Also, taking the advantage of the chair, I'll request all of you who are present here to please go and read Tricontinental materials too, as well as, of course, listen to to read the books which Professor Prabhat is writing, and he actually writes a lot and comes on interviews, so it's very important. So we can end, but yeah, there is. I mean, do you want to take this last question?
You mean about China being really communist?
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. Look, there are all kinds of problems with China and so on. There were all kinds of problems with the communist countries, but our fight is against imperialism. When I was a student, there was a lot of talk about the Soviet Union being social imperialist and this and that, which actually, in some sense, did not differentiate between imperialism and social imperialism. I think that's wrong. I think we have to be absolutely clear which is the main enemy today. And the main enemy, I simply cannot possibly convey to you the strength of my feeling on this, that the main enemy today is actually US imperialism that is really riding roughshod over the sovereignty of nations, including our own. I mean, I come from a communist family. My father was a freedom fighter, and he went to jail for 10 years. And to imagine that once more this country would be reduced to the status of losing its sovereignty is something which I find appalling, unbelievable. So one can have criticisms of China, but China is one country that is standing with the with the embattled third world. Okay, and I think that is the point we have to be clear about.
Thank you so much, Comrade, for this. I think this is very important and a very important intervention, especially in today's time. And I'm pretty sure all our comrades must have taken notes. Please feel free to reach out to Professor Prabhat. If you want to also write to the Tricontinental team, please feel free. And on that note, thank you, Professor Prabhat. Thank you to everyone who came and joined this important meeting. And I think Manu wants to say something. Yeah, Manu, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for such a wonderful session. So I'm inviting Arzol for the vote of thanks.
Yes. Yes. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. On behalf of all of us, it is very pleasure to us that we have today a very famous and remarkable professor from JNU, So I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, for sharing such valuable insights. Again, thank you, Prabhat Patnaik. And I would also like to thank our chair, Mr. Atul Chandra, for guiding today's discussion so thoughtfully. And my heartfelt thanks go to the organizing team also for their hard work. This kind of event became possible. And I would also like to thank all participants, all audience, and others members for being such attentive and engaged listeners, because they also gave a valuable time from their busy schedules. And with this, we come to end the 8th Bhagat Singh Memorial Lecture. Thank you all once again, and we have a wonderful evening. And finally, दिल की अमी गहराई से आप तमाम लोगों को मुबारकबाद एंड शुक्रिया. आप तमाम लोगों का दिन शुभ हो. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Take care. Bye. Bye, sir. Bye.
Bye.